for climate change. Tackle climate change.
Are changing the climate.
For climate change. Awareness.
Of climate change.
How dare you!
On climate change,
Climate change.
Climate change.
Everyone knows climate change is a real problem. Global warming, melting of the ice caps, rising sea levels, all that stuff. It's not a good situation to be in. Literally every single aspect of climate change is impactful to millions of people, and most of the time in a negative way. And at the core of it, global warming is a pretty simple concept. The more energy from the sun gets trapped on the planet, the worse it is. And that's exactly what greenhouse gases do. They absorb infrared radiation from the sun, then re-emit it in all directions, heating up the atmosphere. In addition to that, said gases also prevent heat from the surface from radiating into space. So there's pretty much two things we can do to reduce this global warming effect: reduce amount of energy trapping gases in the atmosphere, or reduce the amount of energy that hits the planet. And removing greenhouse gases is an extremely complicated process that will take decades, so maybe we should instead just block some of the sun's energy instead. A while ago I saw a video by Joe Scott discussing solution of this very problem with solar shades. And since I'm very lazy to do math, I'm just going to base everything in this video on calculations done by Joe and his team. As a quick overview of information in Joe's video, basically in order to reduce global warming effects on planet Earth, we'd need to block roughly 2% of solar energy. That doesn't seem like a lot, but that would significantly reduce effects of greenhouse gases, and it would lower global temperatures to a manageable point. The basic idea of how to do it is blocking out the sun with an array of space shades placed in Lagrange point 1. Lagrange points are areas around celestial bodies in star systems where gravity of the star and gravity of celestial body balance each other, resulting in a stable area with basically no gravitational pull from either body. Any two orbital bodies have 5 Lagrange points in the orbital plane of said two bodies. Anything placed into these points theoretically would stay there forever if no outside force pushed it out. So, if we place solar shades in Lagrange point 1, which is between sun and the Earth, shades would stay there for a very long time, blocking the solar radiation and light from reaching the Earth. These shades would need to be adjusted over time, because light pressure could still push them out of Lagrange point area, but these are the best possible areas for long-term deployment of such shades. In his video, Joe calculated that in order to block 2% of incoming solar energy, we'd need around 2.6 million square kilometers of solar shades in Lagrange point 1. That is an enormous area, basically third the size of the United States. And in order to put anything of such scale into space, we'd need stupid amount of rockets and rocket launches. In their calculations, Joe used 1 millimeter thick discs of glass with diameter of 8.75 meters as shades. They also used SpaceX's Starship as the payload delivery and deployment vehicle. In order to cover entire 2.6 million square kilometers, assuming each rocket can carry about 900,000 square meters worth of shades, we would need close to 3 million rocket launches. That is insane number of rocket launches, several thousand times more rocket launches than have ever been done in the entire history of space exploration. And greenhouse gases emitted from all these rocket launches would basically negate the whole point of doing this in the first place, not to mention all the emissions from just the production and transportation of all these solar shades. This would easily be the biggest project humanity has ever done, by an insanely huge margin. And at our current technology levels, this idea is pretty much impossible. Just the price tag alone for such operation would be at least $2.2 quadrillion, 26 times more than entire world's GDP. So clearly, that's an impossible project. However, I've thought about those numbers quite a bit recently, and I think there could be a way to do this project with way less resources and for a lot less money. It all depends on the material used to make the solar shades. Joe Scott used glass, but I think Bopet would make a better solar shade. Boppet, or biaxially oriented polyethylene terephthalate, also known as mylar, is a polyester film used for extremely large range of applications due to its properties. For how thin mylar usually is, it has incredible tensile strength and acts as electric insulator. Some of the more notable uses for mylar were the geodesic dome built by Buckminster Fuller in 1953. Also, Kodak used it as base for photographic film for U-2 spy plane reconnaissance flights. Metallized version of this film is also intended to be used as solar sails. Mylar can be metallized by vapor deposition of various metals as a thin film on the surface of mylar. Depending on the coating, mylar can have different properties, such as light reflection, heat absorption, increased heat resistance, etc. But how big would the solar shades of mylar have to be, and how many launches would it take? Well, we need to know what rockets could be used for this mission, because that will determine the dimensions of solar shades that we can deploy. SpaceX's Starship is probably the only rocket that we could realistically use, as it's not only the tallest and most powerful rocket ever, but it's also totally reusable, which is necessary for this idea to be even remotely possible. The Starship payload fairing is around 9 meters in diameter and 18 meters high, with about 1,100 cubic meters of volume, so it can lift quite a lot of stuff. Based on those specifications, we can now figure out the size of solar shades. But before that, we need to consider a few things. First of all, we need shades to be as big as possible. In ideal situation, the entire volume of Starship would be taken by a single shade to cut down on unused space. It would also probably be easier to find a way to produce one single big Mylar shade than to produce a lot of smaller ones and somehow connect them in space. So we need a massive shade. And we also need a way to fold it in some specific way that would allow it to fit into Starship. We also need some way to keep solar shade under tension. Since Mylar is basically just a film with a coating, while it has high tensile strength, it can't maintain its form without some sort of tensile stress to block the most light possible while also keeping the shade in L1 Lagrange point for as long as possible. The surface of the shade should also be not flat, but slightly wrinkly, and coated in some highly absorbent coating. So, how would such a shade look like? Well, according to Google, typical metallized solar sail is about 5 microns thick. Because we would be deploying such a sail for long duration and direct sunlight, we'd probably need thicker film with some extra coating for increased light absorption and increased heat resistance, as any body that absorbs light will heat up. So let's be generous and double that thickness to 10 microns to account for thicker film and more coating. Now, we know the dimensions of Starship's payload fairing, which are 9 meters by 18 meters. We should assume there will be some additional stuff, like tension cables and possible maneuver gear added to sails, and all that is going to take some space. So for this example, let's assume the total dimensions available for space shade are 8.75 meters by 17.5 meters, according to a calculator I've found online. Into that space, we could fit 6,013.2 kilometer long strip of material. That is extremely long. In fact, it's longer than would be realistically producible, and that strip would be extremely narrow. What we need is a larger shape, something like a square. I did some calculations, and theoretically, we could fit 10,400 by 10,400 meter square sheet of Mylar into payload fairing of Starship if the square sheet was folded in a particular way. While it would probably be a challenge, considering how thin that Mylar is, in theory it would probably be doable. 10,400 by 10,400 meter sheet is slightly larger than 108 square kilometers, which is a gigantic area. If every Starship could deploy 108 square kilometers of solar block, we would only need around 24,000 Starship launches. It's still a gigantic amount of rocket launches, but it's drastic cut down from Joe Scott's calculated almost 2.9 million launches. And in the future, as new rockets are developed with more payload capability, every rocket could deploy larger shade, so amount of launches could reduce even further. Of course, that still leaves the problem of solar shades actually having to unfold properly and being under tension. One of possible solutions for that would be to have a cable perimeter around the shade to keep it tensed, and to have small ion engines constantly providing thrust at very slight angle to put enough tension on perimeter cables to maintain shape of the shade, but not enough tension to snap the cables. Also, these engines would keep solar sail in position within L1 Lagrange point, as solar light would constantly be blowing the shades away, and sun would definitely blow these shades away in time. We'd need some really powerful ion engines to keep shades in fixed position long enough for any effect they have to actually reflect on the planet. But to know exactly how powerful these engines would have to be, we need to know exactly how much light our shades would absorb and how much light pressure they'd be under. Let's assume we paint our solar shades with Vantablack, the blackest paint ever produced. It can absorb 99.965% of all incoming light. It's very close to perfect absorbance. The reason why we would have to paint the shades in absorbing color instead of making them reflective is light pressure. While perfectly reflectant surface would experience 9.08 micropascals of light pressure per square meter at the distance of 1 astronomical unit, perfectly absorbent surface would experience 4.54 micropascals of light pressure per square meter at the same distance, which is only half as much. Since our solar shades would be slightly closer to the sun and would absorb very slightly less light, let's assume they would experience around 4.65 micropascals per square meter, which means our 108.24 square kilometer shades would experience around 492 pascal of pressure across the entire shade surface. Considering how weak ion engines actually are, we'd need to hilariously many engines to keep the solar blocks from being blown away. A single shade would require multiple thousands of engines. Probably the majority of the cost for this project would come just from the production of these engines. Of course, in the future more efficient and more powerful engines would be created, but still, like half the cost of the project would be just engines. According to SpaceX, Starship will eventually cost around $1 million per launch. This means that just launching 24,000 Starships would cost around $24 billion. I don't know the exact price of Mylar production, but some sites I've found priced it at about 40 cents on average per square meter of 5-micron thick metallized Mylar. Considering we'd need some custom coatings and paints and whatnot, and to make calculations simpler, let's just assume every square meter of shade Mylar is $1. For all the 2.6 million square kilometers, we would need about $2,600 billion. Prices for ion engines are basically impossible to find, so considering economies of scale and advances in near future, let's just price every engine at $1 million and assume every single solar shade would need 2,000 of such engines. Price for all engines for all shades at $1 million per engine will be $48 trillion. So including $48 trillion for engines, $2,600 billion for Mylar, and $24 billion for Starship launches, the total price of this project, not including other miscellaneous costs, is $50,624 billion, to encompass additional costs like transportation, accommodation, price of energy, resource manufacturing, and all other costs that are involved in any kind of manufacturing and development process. Let's just say the price for this entire project is $100 trillion. GDP of the entire world in 2021 was $96.51 trillion. So this definitely would be stupendously extreme and costly project to complete, even if it is like 40 times cheaper than projections by Joe. However, aside from extreme cost, this project also has a number of very big issues. One of the biggest problems are the engines. Currently, no engines exist that would be both powerful and efficient and compact enough to be used in such mega project. Even X3, the most powerful ion thruster NASA have developed so far, wouldn't be enough even if we had like 2,000 of them per shade. We would need to really step up ion engine technology, and sadly, ion engines are pretty much the only possible solution to this problem, as only ion engines are fuel efficient enough to provide thrust for long periods of time required for any long-term deployment of solar shades. Other kinds of engines simply don't have the long-term thrust capability. Chemical engines provide a lot of thrust, but only once and only for a very limited duration. Other kinds of engines also either only provide thrust for a short while or aren't nearly powerful enough to be used on such project. So ion engines are the only option. But the absolutely biggest problem with this project isn't the engines, or the complexity of such mega project, or even the cost. The biggest problem is the weight. Every single solar shade would weigh over 1,500 tons, and that's just for the shade, not even considering the support structures, or engines, or fuel for the engines. Even the most optimistic calculations put payload weight capacity of Starship at 250 tons, and that's just a low Earth orbit. L1 Lagrange point is considerably further away, which means rocket would have to carry more fuel and less payload. And since Starship is reusable, it would have to carry even more fuel to reach the L1 Lagrange point and then to be able to return back to Earth. For deep space missions, Starship might only be able to carry 150 tons or so. Because of the enormous potential of solar sails, there are materials in development that could reduce the sail material weight by a factor of 30, or even more. The same materials could be used for solar shades. If such superlight compounds were used instead of regular Mylar, it actually might be possible to fit within weight limits of launch vehicles like Starship, in which case the only limiting factors to this project would be time and funding. It would be even better if solar shades were produced on and launched from the moon. Not only the reduced gravity on the moon would allow launch rockets to use less fuel, but because of rotation of the moon around Earth, the distance from the moon to L1 Lagrange point would be significantly shorter than distance from Earth to L1 Lagrange point, which means rockets would have to travel significantly shorter distance. A round trip from Earth to L1 Lagrange point is around 3 million kilometers. The same trip from Moon is about 2.4 million kilometers, which is 20% shorter distance. Considering NASA plans to colonize Moon in near future, a solar shade manufacturing industry on the Moon would be considerably cheaper and much more efficient than on Earth. Of course, by the time we're neck deep in melted icebergs, 2% of light blocked probably won't be enough, and we would have to block 3, 4, or even 5% of light. But it literally might be the only choice we have to save the planet. But what do you think?